Author Erwin Lutzer shares a letter that was written to him. It was written by a Christian who lived during Hitler's Germany, and the man writes to share his story. And I just want to read it to you. He writes, "I lived in Germany during the Nazi Holocaust. I considered myself a Christian. We heard stories of what was happening to the Jews, but we tried to distance ourselves from all of that because what could anyone really do to stop it? A railroad track ran behind our small church. On each Sunday morning, we could hear the whistle in the distance and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by. We realized it was carrying Jews like cattle in those cars. Week after week," he writes, "the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear that sound because we knew that it would soon be followed by the cries of Jews en route to a death camp, and their screams tormented us. We also knew that the time during the church service that the train was coming, and so when we heard the whistle blow, letting us know that it was drawing closer, we would begin singing hymns. And by the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the top of our voices. If we heard the screams still, we sang more loudly, and soon we heard them no more." And he goes on and he writes, "That was a long time ago, and many years have passed, and no one talks about it anymore. But I still hear that train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me," he writes. "Forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians and yet did nothing." The word I want to talk to you about this morning is the word complacent. And I suppose that word doesn't sound very dangerous, doesn't sound very threatening. We wouldn't call a complacent person an evil person. And I suppose if you were coming up with a list of concerns that we have in our world right now, and you were putting together your own list, I doubt that complacency would make your list. Maybe, but I doubt it. It just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But what if I told you that the greatest threat to the world today is a church full of complacent followers of Jesus? 2024 promises to be a volatile year. Election years in our country always tend to cause tension among the masses, but this year, especially in light of the events that happened at our nation's capital shortly after the last presidential election, this year has the potential of being extremely volatile and even more hostile. And we're not really sure what to expect. We don't know what will happen. Some of you maybe remember in chemistry class doing labs. You remember doing this where you would take different elements and you would mix them together and then you would see what happened? Do a little experiment, see what kind of reaction you would get. I feel like that's a bit of the season that we find ourselves in now, where you just take just a combination of things. And there's this fear and anxiety about health, and you add that with some stress and strain around finances. And you mix that together with a lot of political division, and you add that with a lot of antagonizing language and these nonstop, inciting news headlines and constant provoking posts on social media, and then you just see a reaction. We've witnessed a lot of that the past couple of years, rioting in the streets, in-your-face protests and confrontations, and it's shameful. It's scary. It feels a little bit surreal. In some ways, it's shocking, but it shouldn't necessarily be shocking because there's just this helplessness, this combination of different elements. It feels like they've all come together. And we all want to do something, right? But what do? We want to respond in the right way, but how? At least as followers of Jesus, if we could talk to those of you today who are followers of Jesus, how do we respond? Because what I know is we don't want to be complacent, right? We don't want to cover our ears and just gather together in our sanctuaries or in our living rooms and sing more loudly as the train passes by. I mean, that's not what we want to do in this time of history. And there are some who would say and who would think that the opposite of complacency is aggressive hostility. That if you're not cursing those who are against you, if you're not raging against those who disagree with you, then that somehow makes you complacent. There are some people who feel that way. And yet our example is the example of Jesus. And he was always pressured. People were always trying to pressure him to take sides. They were always trying to pressure him to change the world with some sort of political power and position, to change the world by force. I mean, that's how you did it. And Jesus just refused to take part in that political approach. Now, that's not to say that Jesus didn't speak politically. He did. He talked a lot about the kingdom that he was bringing, but it was a whole new kingdom. And he rejected the power and the position that tends to go along with politics. But people were always trying to put that on him. And I think it frustrated the disciples. They wanted Jesus to step into this position of power because they would rise along with him, right? And he just refused to do it, just wouldn't do it. Sometimes he was asked political questions and he usually just gave, the quick answer. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and then he'd just move on. There are so many opportunities he would have had to talk about the different politics of the day in different ways, but he didn't do it. And again, it's not to say that he wasn't political. He was just bringing in a whole new kingdom. And the disciples struggled with this. They were frustrated by it. I think in part this is one of the reasons why Judas betrayed Jesus. We think of Judas betrayed Jesus for the money. He was just greedy and he wanted the 30 pieces of silver. But I think it was more than that. Because 4 days before the betrayal, think about what happened with me. Jesus is walking or he's riding on a donkey and the crowd has gathered on either side of him and they're ready to crown him king. Like this is the moment. It's the moment they've been waiting for. It's the moment for him to take political power and position. The timing is perfect. The disciples knew that Jesus could do it. They knew he had the power, and this was the opportunity. And again, Jesus refuses. And so Judas betrays Jesus. He leads hundreds of soldiers into a garden where Jesus is praying, the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think part of what, I don't know this for sure, but I think part of what Judas was doing was trying to force Jesus into a position to show what kind of power he had. Surround him with hundreds of Roman soldiers and then stand back and see what he can do. Well, the soldiers come. John 18 says that they ask, which one of you is Jesus? And Jesus says, I am he. And the moment he says it, they all fall to the ground. The moment he says, I am he, all the soldiers fall to the ground. And now the disciples are like, okay, here we go. We've been waiting for this. It's go time. And Peter pulls out that sword and he lops off the ear of one of the Roman soldiers. And what does Jesus do? He heals the man. He says, hey, listen, this is not why I've come. An insurrection is not what I've come to lead. Well, is it because he didn't have the power? Oh, he had the power. In fact, Matthew puts it this way. Matthew 26, Jesus says at this time, he says, don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands And this number here is like 72,000. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and He would send them instantly? Did you think this was a question of power? Did you not know that I just give a head nod? I mean, that's all it takes, just a little head nod, and 72,000 angels can wipe out these soldiers? But that's not the kingdom He came to bring. He didn't come to bring a kingdom of hostility. He came to bring a different kind of kingdom. And now was that because He was complacent? No, it's not because He was complacent. He just came to bring a different kingdom. And in the kingdom that Jesus came to bring, you consider others better than yourselves. He describes the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount. In the kingdom that He came to bring, someone strikes you on the cheek and you turn the other cheek as well. And you say, well, that sounds cowardly. Okay, well, try it sometime. It takes a lot of courage. In the kingdom that He came to bring, if someone sues you for your shirt, you give him your coat. If someone says, hey, you walk 1 mile, you go 2 miles. In the kingdom that He came to bring, listen, in the kingdom He came to bring, you bless those who curse you. You don't curse those who curse you. You bless those who curse you, and you love your enemies. I mean, this is the kingdom that we're committed to. If you're a follower of Jesus, this is the kingdom that you are called to advance. If you're a follower of Jesus, you can speak up about your political beliefs, especially in the country in which we live. You can speak up about your opinions and ideologies that you disagree with. You can take a stand and you can make your case. But listen, the moment that you stop loving your enemies, the moment you start to curse those who disagree with you, you need to sit down and shut your mouth. Because that's not the kingdom that Jesus came to bring. That's not the kingdom that He came to advance. It's not just what you say, it's the way that you say it. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it. It's not just the cause that you're committed to, it's the Spirit of Christ. And so you can do the right things and you can have the right policies, but if you don't do that with the humility and love and compassion of Jesus, you're better off just staying on the sideline. We need the Spirit of Christ. And Jesus, you think that's harsh? You go back and you read what Jesus says to the Pharisees who lived that way. They were doing the right things, but they didn't have the right heart towards people. It's not just the cause that we're committed to, it is Christ. It's the way of Jesus. Our country recently observed Martin Luther King Day. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, preached this in powerful ways. That it's not just the cause. We don't want to just be committed to a cause, but we want to be committed to the way that Jesus teaches, that you love your enemies. Martin Luther King says, darkness can't drive out darkness. He says, only light can do that. In a letter in his publication, or in his letter from a Birmingham jail that would later become a publication, he wrote about how the early Christians changed the world. And I love how he describes the early church. He describes them as small in number, but big in commitment. Small in number, but big in commitment. But what were they committed to? Well, they were committed to the way of Christ. And he writes about what he calls, and I love this, what he calls the gospel glow of the early Christians. that this is how the early church changed the world. It wasn't through power and position, it was through love and compassion. That's the way of Jesus. That's the Jesus way. Philip Yancey wrote a book a few years ago called The Jesus I Never Knew. I'd recommend it to those of you who want to learn a little bit more about Jesus. And I just want to quote a part of this book here to you today where he addresses this. Yancey says, regardless of the merits of a given political issue, no matter how valid you think your political perspective is on any given issue, whether it's a pro-life lobby on the right or a peace and justice lobby on the left, political movements risk pulling onto themselves the mantle of power that smothers love. From Jesus, I learned that whatever activism I get involved in, it must not drive out love and humility, or otherwise I betray the kingdom of heaven. And so we want to do something. We don't want to be complacent. But let me just say, don't confuse humility and love with complacency. Jesus was not complacent. In the same way, don't confuse hostility and rage with commitment. And so Jesus sets for us this example. It's the example that the early church followed. It's what they modeled. And in this series called Unleashed, we're studying through different narratives in the book of Acts where they're living out the kingdom of heaven through the church. And so one of the things that we say here, our vision for our church this year, the commitment that we've made as we begin this new year, is that we want to unleash the full force of the church to love people one at a time. This was the Jesus way of changing the world. And we see that consistently all throughout the book of Acts, that this is how the early church had such tremendous impact. And so I want to give you just a couple of examples, a couple of stories from the book of Acts that demonstrate the difference between complacency and commitment. And we're going to look at Acts chapters 4 and 5. This is a story of a couple who starts out committed, but they become complacent. And complacency has a way of leading to compromise. And so just a little context here. We're going to start in Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32. It says this, all the believers, lots of unity here. All the believers were one in heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. That's how united they were. But they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. This is the message of the early church. They're preaching Jesus and the resurrection of Christ. And the Bible says that God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all, that there were no needy persons among them. And so one of the ways that you see the power of God at work through a church is in taking care of people who are in need. It's one of the evidences that God is at work in a church. And here's how that happened. Here's one of the ways that happened. It says, from time to time, those who owned lands or houses sold them and brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to anyone who had a need. And so I just want to point out a couple of things as we think about moving from complacent to committed. That the early church demonstrated their commitment through sacrificial generosity. And so commitment is demonstrated by what we sacrifice for. Sacrifice is defined as giving up something that you love for something or someone that you love more. You show me who or what you sacrifice for, and I'll show you who or what you are committed to. Jesus is the one who made this connection for us. He talked a lot about money because money tells the story of your commitment. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, "For wherever your riches, wherever your treasures are, that's where your heart is going to be also." That's what you are. That's what you're committed to. What you sacrifice for reveals the level, the depth of your commitment. And so the early church modeled their commitment through sacrificial generosity. Then the second thing I want to draw your attention to there in Acts chapter 4 is that they helped people in need by giving through the church. We talk about giving to the church, but what we really see here is that they gave through the church. And the reason I want to point this out is if you study church history, this is one of the factors of why the early church had such an impact on the world. It's because the believers came together and they gave generously to help people in need, but they did it through the church. And in doing it through the church, it pointed people to Jesus and it connected people to a family. To a church family. Now I'll tell you, if I'm just being honest, that's not necessarily how I like to do giving. It feels better to me personally, if I'm going to be generous, if I just give it individually. And certainly that's good. It's good to do that kind of giving and that kind of generosity. I'd rather just give it directly to an organization. And then I get some recognition, maybe a little pat on the back, and I feel a little bit better about myself. But the early church had such an impact upon that culture because the believers were giving sacrificially. And then the church was able to give to people who were in need. And one of the things that happened in that moment was that the people are drawn to Jesus. They're drawn to the church. Now, we have a harder time with that because we kind of like a little recognition. But when we give that way, it takes our ego out of it and it gives recognition to Jesus. And so in chapter 5, we read about a couple. We read that some people would sell their land and homes, and on occasion they would bring it to the church. And it's not that they didn't love their land or homes, because they did. They just, they loved the mission that they were called to be a part of more. And so in Acts chapter 5, here's what we read with this couple. "But there was a certain man named Ananias who, with his wife Sapphira, sold some property. He brought part of the money to the apostles, but he claimed it was the full amount. With his wife's consent, he kept the rest." And so do you hear the problem here? It's not that they didn't give all the money. It's that they said they were going to give all the money, and then they only gave part of it. The problem, the issue was an issue of commitment. What they were doing is different than what they said they would do. And so in Acts chapter 5, verse 4, it tells us that Peter confronts Ananias about this. And Peter says, "How could you do this thing? You're not lying to us, but you're lying to God." It's not just us, Peter says. It's God that you're lying to. It's God that you're withholding from. And we're going to see how seriously God takes the commitments that we make. Verse 5 says, "When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died." Wait a minute. What? He gave some of the money. Well, it's not about that. It's about the commitment that he made. It's about the community that he was a part of. God takes those things seriously. He's undermining the whole community as he does this. Acts 5:7 reads, about 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, was this the price? Was this the amount here? Is this really the price that you and your husband received for your land? Yes, she replied, that was the price. And Peter said, how could the two of you even think about conspiring to test the Spirit of the Lord like this? The young men who buried your husband are just outside the door, and they will carry you out too. And instantly she fell on the floor and she died. Well, that seems a little extreme, right? I mean, that seems really dramatic, especially if you've never heard this story before. I mean, this had to help giving for a while. I would imagine that, but it's just a little unexpected. Now, I suppose if you've known the story for a while, it doesn't seem nearly as surprising. I mean, I learned the story as a kid. When I was just in elementary school, in church, they had a kid's song that we sang about Ananias and Sapphira. It told the story in the song. You know what I'm talking about? Ananias and Sapphira. But here's the story that they learned along with the song. It goes like this. Ananias and Sapphira got together to conspire a plot to cheat the church and get ahead. They knew God's power but didn't fear it. Tried to cheat the Holy Spirit. Peter prophesied it and they both dropped dead. Oh, that's the song that we sang as a kid. And then it goes, and they both dropped dead. Oh, God loves a cheerful giver. Give him all you've got. And that's the song. And so it seems, a little drastic. But really the message here is that we clearly underestimate just how much this matters to God. And we don't like to talk about some of these things, right? We don't like to talk about money. We don't like to talk about the personal commitments that we make. And yet Jesus talked a lot about it because money tells the story of our commitments. Money has a way of testifying to what we are committed to. In James chapter 5, James writes to people who are rich. But the problem is their selfishness. The people who are, he says, these are people who are arrogant in their wealth. And James 5:2 says, your wealth is rotting away. Your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. The corroded treasure you have hoarded, listen to this, will testify against you on the day of judgment. This is such a different way to look at money and possessions. You think the stacks of cash and the pile of possessions that you accumulate throughout your lifetime, that when you die, that they'll testify to your success. No, James says they testify against you. They testify against you. The Message puts it this way, you thought you were piling up wealth, but what you've piled up is judgment. So Acts 5 gives us kind of a glimpse of this judgment with Ananias and Sapphira. And I want to draw your attention to verse 4 where Peter says to Ananias, how could you do a thing like this? How could you do a thing like this? Now look, he didn't get a chance to answer, but I think I understand. I do. I think it has to do a lot with complacency. He got complacent. When he first thought about doing something like this, he probably thought, no, that's a bad idea. I committed the full amount and I'm going to give the full amount. But then he started thinking about different ways that he could use that money if they kept some of it for themselves. But then he didn't want to lose face with the rest of the community and the church. And so, hey, we just don't need to tell. What if we just give them part of the money, but we'll tell them we gave all of it. It's complacency. complacent with the truth, complacent with commitment, complacent with community that trusts you, complacent with what matters to God. And so I want us to talk about that because I know God is calling us as a church in this season. He's calling us out of complacency. But the challenge that I struggle with is, how do you call complacent people to not be complacent, right? I mean, how do you do that? You're complacent about complacency, and so you don't really care by definition about being complacent. And so how do you do that? Well, I want to give you just some different descriptions of complacency to help us, I hope, to help us to wake up. Number one, complacency is a feeling of indifference that settles in over a period of time. Just getting used to the way things are. At first, something disturbs you and you think, well, I need to do something about that. But over time, you begin to accept it and you move into the house and a train goes by your house. And at first, all you can hear, all you can think about is that. But over the years, you don't even notice it. Number two, complacency is the inner voice that convinces you that someone else will do something. And we talk about this at church. In psychology, it's called the bystander effect. It's this idea that if you're sitting in a crowd of people, if you're aware that there's tens or hundreds or even thousands of people, you just think, well, it's not that I don't care about it, but somebody else will do something. Someone else will, someone else who has more time, they'll serve. Or someone else who has more money, they'll give. Someone else will sponsor the child. Someone else will do something about human trafficking. Someone else will take in a foster child. Someone else will certainly do something. That's complacency. And then number three, complacency is often disguised as procrastination. It's not that I'm not going to do something. I'm just not going to do something right now. And so it's Ananias saying to Sapphira, hey, it's not so much a lie because, we can make it right later. And then number four, complacency is this unhealthy and unaware self-satisfaction with your life. Where you just, it's kind of the husband. It's not just husbands, but husbands have a way of doing this. They compare their husbandry. Now, wives tend to go the opposite direction, but husbands tend to compare their husbandness by looking at the lower common denominators, right? Like they measure themselves on a curve. Or, I'm one of these, we tend to feel better about ourselves as husbands by turning husbanding into a competition and then comparing ourselves to the people that we think we're doing better than. And that is a common approach to difference making. This is how we often measure influence and impact. We turn it into a competition, and then we intentionally make sure that we are competing with people that we feel like we're doing a little better than. And we have this kind of unhealthy and unaware self-satisfaction with what God wants to do in us and through us. And then number five, complacency is inaction when an impending threat calls for action. There's something that's happening and you need to do something about it, but you're not doing anything. It's like the wildfires that they often have in California, where they go and they pound on the doors of people trying to get people to evacuate because the people don't realize just how close the fire is. And the people think that they still have time. And so they're watching. They're watching on the news in their family room this fire that's happening, that's threatening their very home. But they're not leaving. And in this season, it's one of the things that we're going to be doing as a church. We're going to be doing some pounding on doors. We are going to try and help people wake up and recognize the urgency of the season that we're in. That the return of Jesus is closer than you think. We're going to help people recognize the urgency of the world, the needs of the world that we live in. We're not going to turn away from that. We're not just going to, change the channel. We're going to get up and we're going to answer the door. I was reading about an occupation in the early 20th century Britain. It's a job where people who did this job were responsible to go by and knock on the doors of other people in the community and wake them up. That was their job. And the title, this is the truth, this is what they were called, I'm not making this up. The person who did this job, the title of the job was, they were called the knocker-upper. Really unfortunate name, but you Google it, and that's what they were called, the knocker-upper. And that's what they would do. They would stay up, and then they would go around, and they would knock. Because there weren't any alarm clocks that were reliable, and so people depended on the knocker-uppers to come by and knock on the door and make sure that they were up and that they were ready. And there's a sense in which this is what we need to be doing a lot of in this season. That we'll be making sure that people are awake and ready for the opportunities. That there are things that call for action that we need to lean into. And then number 6, complacency is making a choice to play it safe and to take it easy. Hey, I've done enough. I put in my time. I've worked hard enough. It's the man that Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 12 who decides to tear down his barns and to build bigger ones. And the man tells himself in verse 19, and then I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy. Take it easy. And eat, drink, and be merry. And so what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that his goal in life is complacency. His goal in life is to just be complacent. And God says of this man in the next verse that you're a fool if that's how you're living your life. This life is just a moment. We're here for just a breath. I would encourage this on your own. I would encourage you to read the next couple of chapters of Acts. Read Acts chapter 6 and 7, because in those chapters you'll find the story of Stephen. Stephen is one of the early church leaders who goes from sitting to serving, and God gives him more opportunities. And then the people who killed Jesus, as you'll see, they threaten Stephen and they start to spread lies about Stephen. And Stephen just refuses to take it personally, to defend himself. Instead, he just keeps on talking to them about Jesus. He just keeps putting the focus on Jesus. And it just comes down to this moment where he has to decide, am I going to live for myself? Or am I going to live for Jesus and the mission that he gave the church? And it's my prayer for us that this moment, that really this series would be a moment like that for us, where we would decide, are we going to be complacent? Or are we going to be committed? It may not be as intense as it was for Ananias and Sapphira, or as dramatic as it was for Stephen, but am I going to be committed? Am I going to get up and be a part of it? Or am I just going to settle for this complacent life? How do you try to wake someone up if they're struggling with complacency? I don't know. But I hope some of you are hearing an alarm and it's getting your attention. I hope that's one of the ways that God has been working in your life, is He's working through circumstances and situations to help you get a different perspective on this world, to help you see things through the lens of eternity. And so we want to sound the alarm. We want to pound on the door because the whistle is blowing and the train is passing by. And we're not just going to gather together and sing louder, because I believe that these may be the moments, and this may be the year that tells the story of complacent or committed.